assistant professor at SUNY Oneonta in Central New York State. I'm also a mom of 5-year-old triplets, fun fact. And I have extensive experience working in 9th through 12th grade. I used to be an English language arts teacher, an English as a second language supervisor, and I did that work when I was in Houston, Texas. And since 2018, I've been working with the Freedom Project Network and their high schoolers in underserved communities in parts of Mississippi. So very passionate about all things education and very passionate about the vision that I'm going to share with you today. Today, I'm inviting you to reimagine the classics, how we teach them, how we engage with them, and how they can be tools for liberation when approached through what I call the Togetherness Wayfinder, which I outline in great depth in my most recent book, The Raceless Anti-Racist: Why Ending Race is the Future of Anti-Racism. And some of you in earlier sessions asked particular types of questions that I contend my Wayfinder approach can offer you solutions to. So again, I'm really excited and privileged to spend time with you today. The Togetherness Wayfinder is an educational and philosophical framework I developed to challenge systemic racism at its roots by questioning and ultimately desiring to end the belief in and practice of race. As such, it's a path toward belonging, humanization, and critical liberation for all people. In education, and especially in the study of the classics, this framework helps us move beyond identity-bound interpretations to see the deeper connections across time, culture, and humanity. As the creator and innovator of the Togetherness Wayfinder, formerly the theory of racistness, I help educators create curriculum that includes and/or is done through the Wayfinder framework toward enriched and more generative learning objectives. Now, when I say framework, what I mean is I'm offering a toolkit. There are rules, there are tools, there are linguistic components, there are concepts, there are philosophies, there's particular information, historical and scientific information. There's also something I call the racistness translator, which is our ability to see where race is presumed to be, usually through the language of race that we're most susceptible to or most familiar with, right? The color coding that we do to human beings. And then do the work of translating what is actually being communicated here through race language. Is it something about racism itself? Is it something cultural, ethnic? Is it about social class, economic class, or some combination thereof? And one analogy I like to use is Scooby-Doo. So for those of you familiar with Scooby-Doo, the classic plot line would have the crew following a villain, chasing after a villain. The villain usually has some type of disguise or mask. And at the end of the episode, they demask the villain once they've caught them. And in this scenario, imagine we're chasing after race, right? And in a literal black and white color, split right down the middle, word race is right on the forehead. And we catch race and we demask race. And then race shapeshifts into those 5 entities that I named: culture, ethnicity, social or economic class, racism itself, or some combination thereof. That's the work of the translator. And when taken as a whole, right, from the linguistic components to the rules, to the translator, to the philosophy, this is how we can start to more effectively build bridges between how any of us thinks of ourselves, our identities, race included, with how any else of us or any others of us think about the same thing. Let's start this conversation by considering what we mean by the classics. Too often, people, usually in the West, frame the classics too narrowly, primarily as the works of old, dead white men. But classics exist across cultures, of course. Think of the Epic of Sujata, Confucian Analects, the Popol Vuh, or the Epic of Gilgamesh. Even within the so-called Western canon, classical texts are living documents that speak to broader human concerns, freedom, justice, love, and mortality. And all people of all types of nationalities, backgrounds, languages have and continue to engage with the classics, regardless of how one defines it, in meaningful and substantive ways. And we mustn't miss that. Classics endure because they grapple with questions that never stop being relevant to humans, right? What does it mean to be human? What is justice? What is beauty? These texts are not monuments to the past, but instead are invitations to engage, challenge, and reinterpret. And the Togetherness Wayfinder helps us to read these texts not as artifacts, but as active dialogues. And we need to also be honest about the problems that exist, right? And or that have existed. The classics have historically been used to uphold Eurocentrism and by extension, systems of racialized hierarchy. Many students might feel alienated from these texts because of how they've been framed, they being the text, as the text not being for them, for example. Racialized readings can trap both teacher and student in a narrow view of what these texts are and what these texts can do. The Togetherness Wayfinder shifts the focus. Instead of reading Homer or Plato through the lens of race, we ask, what do these texts say about being human, about power, about love or fear? We don't erase difference, but we engage it liberatively. We look for both shared experience and radical difference as ways of growing together. And we do this learning work through the lens of the Wayfinder, which empowers students to, number one, question everything, right? Especially their own beliefs, their own lenses, their own worldviews. And number two, make meaningful connections between the texts, regardless of how long ago they were written, right? And themselves, the texts and those societies that they live in and are witness to. For example, take Plato's Republic, which wrestles with justice, and then take the African philosophy Ubuntu. Ubuntu emphasizes relational being or justice through togetherness. And the English translation of the word Ubuntu is roughly I am because we are. As part of the Togetherness Wayfinder, Ubuntu stands front and center as one way to simultaneously encourage the process of questioning that I spoke to a moment ago, as well as self-development and communal growth. These aren't opposing views, but complementary ways to explore what makes life meaningful. And considering how the philosophy of Ubuntu, coming from largely West Africa, connects with Plato's Republic or any number of other texts that speak to um, what it is to be human and justice, our responsibilities to ourselves, our families, and to our broader communities, right? Putting these seemingly separate and distinct or dissimilar places and times into conversation with each other, that's where some of the magic starts to happen. And that's where a lot of the bridging also starts to happen. The Wayfinder encourages these connections, breaking down false walls between Western and non-Western classics. Or think about Homer's Odyssey and the Epic of Sunjata. Both are stories about heroic journeys, homecoming, identity, and leadership. When we read these works side by side, we see how different cultures approach universal themes, enriching our understanding of both. This method can draw up critical questions about more modern constructions and practices like race/ism, which places and requires limitations on who gets seen and treated as fully human, subhuman, or not at all human, toward the goal of subjugation and oppression. And the primary goal of the Wayfinder, and using it as one of the most effective pathways forward for learners, for any of us, is holding on to, creating, inspiring, engaging with hope and optimism that the problems that exist in human societies right now have not always existed in the same manners that they currently exist. They do not exist in the same ways across place even today, right? And in knowing that and exploring a bit of that, one comes to recognize that the problems that we create and maintain today needn't always exist for those reasons and plenty more. When we teach the classics through the Togetherness Wayfinder, we empower students to think critically, not just about the text, but about the world, about themselves, about each other. We invite them to step outside of limiting frames and engage with literature as human beings together. This is liberating education. The classics belong to all of us, and by applying the Togetherness Wayfinder, we reclaim these texts as tools for building connection, understanding, and liberation. We don't need to discard them, we need to approach them differently. Let's teach for freedom, not fear, and let's read for togetherness, not division. And one thing that strikes me as potentially valuable to state here too, right? I'm speaking about reading the classics, teaching the classics, learning about the classics through the Togetherness Wayfinder as having all of these generative liberatory potentials, right? In my own classrooms, I specialize in African American, Caribbean, and American literature more broadly. And I teach students the Wayfinder as a framework that it is. And then I teach the class through the tools of the Wayfinder. And inevitably, people who often come into the space thinking similarly to how I've described some people think of the classics, right? Like this literature isn't for me. And so I can only engage with it in a superficial manner, or I'm only here because I have to take a class like this for my to graduate, right? So like a combination of disinterest and also a dose of this isn't for me because I don't quote unquote see myself in this literature that I'm set to study in this class. Um, those barriers are addressed, identified, and dismantled by students as soon as we start the process of togetherness wayfinding. Because I've always thought it was thoroughly pernicious that we literally teach every generation in the United States, for example, to see themselves as alien from people who do not get racialized in the same way as them. And James Baldwin used to talk about it in the language of like Mars and Venus. People living in the same communities oftentimes look to the other side of the community and say those people, their lives, it's just so alien and foreign to me, as if we live on different planets and aren't literally in the same community. And so what does it look like to recognize that that is certainly how some people feel, some students feel, when some parents might feel, right, when engaging with different types of bodies of work, and simultaneously, what tools do we need in place to break down effectively those barriers while still maintaining a culture of everyone is seen, everyone is heard, everyone's perspective is valued, right? And that is the work that I'm most passionate about doing. I do it in my students around other types of literature, and I help organizations and other educators in different fields bring this type of effectiveness into their own teaching too. And with that, I will leave you with more food for thought. This is how you can access my most recent book that I mentioned, that is stirring up conversations internationally and garnering more and more attention happily, because this is a conversation that, as a nation in the United States, we have not had, right? We've tried the color blindness thing. We've tried the going in the exact opposite direction of traditional anti-racism, is what we might call it. We have not tried uh, what I'm speaking to here. And so I offer this as an invitation to all of you to dig in, join me on this side of wayfinding, um, and experience the benefits of wayfinding together. At this time, I would love to welcome any questions or comments you have. Thank you.
Sheena, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi, this is Diana Smith. I'm the former principal at Washington Latin Public Charter School in DC. And I just want to say thank you. It's thrilling to hear you articulate so well the